Hi, this is Matt Shirk. The title of my presentation is So You've Decided to Breach Your Recording Contract. And today we're going to talk about recording contracts and how there seems to be an epidemic of musicians who threaten to breach their contracts or actually breach their contracts. We'll start off with some quotes from the music industry. The guitarist from Black Sabbath, Tony Iommi, has this advice: learn to play 2 chords, then get yourself a lawyer before learning the third. Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones says, if you don't go for as much money as you can possibly get, then I think you're stupid. Okay, and I will point out that, of course, he had a wildly successful career, but Mick Jagger did study at the London School of Economics prior to his musical career. Okay, so who's that? Well, that's Jamie Johnson, and he's a well-known Grammy-nominated country music singer-songwriter, and he declares in this interview that he isn't recording any new material because his recording contract is structured in a way so that he doesn't make any money. Okay, so we'll come back to Jamie in just a second. Let's go over some of the basics of the recording contracts. Okay, recording contracts. They're usually bilateral. They're a promise of money for a promise of recording 1 or more songs. They are formal in that they contain particular verbiage and are signed by both parties. Now, one of the more informal written contracts was made by Willie Nelson, who wrote a contract on a napkin where he sold one of his songs for $150. That song went on to be a big country hit, actually. But for the most part, that wouldn't happen anymore. These days, a contract is written and very formal. Recording contracts are express contracts. All the details of what's expected of both parties are spelled out fairly clearly, and this is where many musicians get into trouble. They have certain expectations of what they want from a recording contract and what they think it's going to be, and they don't pay enough attention to the fine print. A lot of times a recording contract is exclusive. They contain provisions so that musicians can't go record on another label. Sometimes you'll see a musician have a contract with a sideman clause, in which case that allows them to sit in on somebody else's album. Okay, recording contracts also require performance to the satisfaction of another, and that might be an agent of the label or a producer or someone like that. But basically the album, after it's recorded, is subject to their approval, and the musician has to be available to re-record if it's found to be not satisfactory. One question that we're going to ask ourselves here: are recording contracts unconscionable, as has been argued by many musicians? Okay, so are they unconscionable? Well, some could argue they're sometimes procedurally unconscionable. They contain some legalese, lots of unintelligible legal jargon. That can happen. Also, they are an adhesion contract. They're written pretty much exclusively by one party and presented to the musician as a take it or leave it. In some ways, they're also substantively unconscionable. They're somewhat oppressive and overly harsh and one-sided, very lopsided in favor of the label. The musician really only gets a small percentage, okay, as we'll see later. And then substantive would also include if one party is deprived of the benefits of the agreement. Okay, recording contracts usually end with the musician having a duty to perform the recording and the label having the right to require them to do so. Also, usually the contract presents an advance of money to the musician for the purposes of recording their first album. In this case, the contract has been substantially undertaken, cannot be revoked, or the record label would be out that advance money. And we'll see an example of that later. Okay, so some quotes from the article with Mr. Jamie Johnson. In the article, the interviewer asked him, "Are you writing? Can we expect any new material?" He says, "Well, I wish I could tell you that I'm writing. I'm not. I wish I could tell you I'm going to go home and record an album. It's not likely to happen. I feel pretty used by the music industry in that my contracts are written in a way that I don't get paid. He doesn't want to work for these people. But he acknowledges, I've clearly got a job that I can't quit. Okay. So another question they asked him, so do you plan to renegotiate your contract? He says in Nashville they think because you signed this contract that you owe them the remainder of the terms of the contract. I say if you're not paying me, I don't care what I think I owe you, what you think I owe you. I don't owe you squat. So he's pretty much putting into print, going on the record as saying that he will not record because he doesn't plan to record because of this contract business. And this could be construed as anticipatory repudiation. According to our book, that's equivalent to a material breach of contract. The label could take immediate action for him saying these things. However, in this case, as in most cases like that, the label, who would be the plaintiff, it's at their discretion if and when they wish to treat the repudiation as a breach. Okay. Then the interviewer asked Jamie, shouldn't that nullify your contract? He says, I believe it does. I don't know the law. Like I said, I'm a general contractor. He was a carpenter once upon a time. As a musician, I never studied music law. I can't even read the contracts I've signed. It's kind of a sign of that legalese there. But I'm fairly sure that they don't say what I thought they said. So he signed a contract he didn't understand. He probably should have sought to understand it better before he signed. So is this fraudulent misrepresentation? Most definitely, Jamie relied on false information, but there's some question over whether that was actually false information or his rock and roll fantasy as opposed to someone trying to deceive him. He could maybe claim that he had a justifiable reliance on some kind of misrepresentation, but he would have a burden of proof to meet that there was any deception instead of his own misconceptions. Now, it is possible that the label's agents made no false statements, but painted a rosier picture than they knew the reality would be. Okay, so it's also possible that Jamie was signaling his displeasure with his contract in a public forum in an effort to get his label to renegotiate. It seems like this happens quite a bit. Musicians of all varieties air their grievances in a public forum. And it's kind of a broken system in that the labels almost expect to be publicly badmouthed by their artists and have to renegotiate. Okay, so what recourse does the music label have in this instance? Well, as happens most of the time, they could renegotiate. Many disputes between the musician and the label are settled out of court. They could sue for compensatory damages. That would be to recover the damages that the advances they've already given Jamie to record albums as advance money. They could sue him for consequential damages. That is the loss of profits to the label because it doesn't have his album to sell. They could discharge by agreement, and both sides could come together and say this contract is null, but they probably wouldn't do that, again, back to that advance money. They would be out a few $1 million, chances are good. Now, they probably wouldn't seek punitive damages on Jamie, just because Jamie probably fully intended to honor his contract. And, here we are, musicians have demonstrated that they don't really read the contracts. So would his punishment prevent others from doing so? I don't think so. Finally, the label could prevent Jamie from recording with another label. Now, this usually happens when record companies merge or the label goes through some financial problems or shifting their priorities, where a musician ends up in limbo because they owe albums to the label, but the label won't release those albums to the public, and so they're kind of stuck. It can also be a strategic measure that a label takes to just prevent their musicians from going and recording with the competition, essentially. This happened to a young singer named JoJo, who had a few hits, including a #1 single, but her record label got bought by a bigger label and had some financial struggles, and she had to fight for many years to get out of that contract so she could go record again. Most musicians love writing and recording music, and so preventing them from doing so can be quite a harsh punishment. Okay, so let's do a quick breakdown of what this monetary recording contract might look like so we can maybe get an idea of why musicians kind of try to buck this system. Okay, so a band signs a contract and they might get $1 million advance, but that is recoupable by the record label. In other words, the record label is going to keep the first $1 million that band made just to pay back this advance. Okay? And out of that advance, recording the album costs about half of that. The band then also has to pay their manager any proceeds, generally in the 15 to 20% category. And then when it's time to sell CDs or electronically or whatever, the band gets a very small rate. So that if somebody sells a CD in a store for $15, the actual musicians are going to get less than $1 of that money. Also, labels tend to withhold a percent of royalties as a packaging charge. And sometimes with contracts, the calculation for digital royalties, iTunes, Apple, or Amazon, etc., are different or non-existent. Recently, musicians are speaking out against Spotify because it pays a very, very small percentage. And then in addition to that first $1 million, the record label might spend another additional $1 million just to promote that album, and they will consider that money also recoupable. So before the album's even released, the band might already owe the record label $2 million. And this is how we end up with situations such as Lyle Lovett, who said that his album sold 4.6 million copies and he didn't make a dime. More recently, the band 30 Seconds to Mars sold 2 million plus copies, which is double platinum, but they never made a dime either. Okay, so could it be argued that the average recording contract is unconscionable? Well, our textbook notes that judges are hesitant to get involved in the determination of whether or not a recording contract is actually fair or a good deal. In some cases, the payouts for popular, good-selling records are weighted very heavily toward the record label. Okay. For example, in 2009, Kenny Rogers filed a lawsuit against his record label, Capitol, and that was in Tennessee, probably due to Nashville being there. He sued them for breach of contract due mostly to their accounting practices. Prior to that, he had requested a financial audit of their accounts for him. It took them 2 years to do that audit, and he discovered more than $80,000 that they owed him. So these record companies aren't really playing nice in many cases. So, what are some strategies that musicians might use to legally end a contract other than just performing their duties and a performance discharge of the contract? Well, one thing that many musicians have done is declare bankruptcy. The Federal Bankruptcy Code states that existing contracts may be rejected if they impair someone's ability to recover financially, and the contract can be voided. So some musicians, such as Tony Braxton, Run DMC, TLC, have successfully used this strategy either to void their contract or to get their label to renegotiate, which is a popular theme. Okay, there's California's 7-year statute. Basically, California's civil code limits the amount of time an individual can be held to a contract for personal services. They limit it at 7 years. Metallica, Luther Vandross, Don Henley have all attempted to break their contracts citing this statute. However, in those cases, the matters were all settled out of court. Again, back to renegotiation. So judges didn't have to rule on that statute. Then there's the $9,000 plus provision, which is a newer code in California, but it basically says that a record company can't prevent a musician from recording for another company unless they pay that person a small annual fee. So they have to pay them $9,000 in the first year, and it's something like $12,000 the next year. It's not a whole lot of money, but they have to keep increasing it, and they have to pay them this amount. Olivia Newton-John attempted to breach her recording contract citing this code. However, she lost because her contract was structured so that she was guaranteed a certain amount of money. There's also the idea of disaffirmance by a minor, which is when that's when a minor maybe signed the contract originally and is now saying, I want out of this contract. David Cassidy from the Partridge Family did this. Once the Partridge Family got very popular and his face was on all kinds of merchandise, he said, I was a minor, I didn't realize what I was getting into, I want to pull out. And that forced, again, the TV studio in that case to come and renegotiate his contract. He ended up being the highest paid child actor up to that point. There's also, you could sue the label for withholding of royalties, just like Kenny Rogers, as we had mentioned earlier. This also happened with the Kingsmen, the guys who recorded Louie Louie. The record label did not pay them the royalties that they were due, and they were released from their contract. A musician might sue the label for an unfair contract, basically saying it's unconscionable. George Michael attempted to sue his record label, stating that it was essentially a restraint of trade. He wasn't making enough money, even though he's hearing himself on the radio all the time. In his case, he lost, however, in the Court of England, saying that unfairness alone isn't enough to void a contract. Some musicians have a lengthy contract with multiple albums, and if they want to get out, they release several albums all at once in order to discharge by performance. Frank Zappa is an example of someone who did this. Occasionally, a contract will have a key man clause, and this isn't just for musicians. This is for a lot of contracts where they say a certain person has to be in place at one of the companies or the contract is void. This happened with Donna Summer, who had named the president of Geffen Records as a key man, and when he left the company, her contract was voided, or discharged, I should say. So, there are my references, by the way. So, in a kind of legal evolution, every lawsuit has made the record labels smarter and better able to foresee problems. Contracts are more thought out than ever, with practically every loophole closed to protect the label. In a nutshell, I think the recording industry needs to rethink these overly harsh contracts and treat the recorded material as part of a multifaceted approach. They need to expand to t-shirt sales and concert tickets and licensing, among other things, so that they can supplement that recorded music and treat it more like a promotional tool. After all, millions of people are freely exchanging digital music every day. Likewise, musicians need to be more realistic about their expectations about how much money they're going to make from a recording contract. They probably also need to educate themselves more on how contracts work and find a good attorney. So there are my references. I had a lot of fun doing my research for this product, and actually heard a lot more stories that I don't have time for. Thanks everybody for watching.